The FBI sent a warning. Not after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, not after the arrest, not after the DNA matched and the search history was traced and the federal charges were filed. Before. That is the detail that has been sitting at the edge of this investigation since the early weeks. Mentioned in fragments, referenced in background conversations with sources familiar with the case, never fully addressed in any official press conference or public statement. A warning that existed somewhere in the institutional record before the Tuesday night, that Nancy Guthrie's internet went dark, and the figure moved along the side of her house, and everything that followed from that moment began. A warning that, if it had been acted on differently, might have changed what happened on Habersham Street, and the sheriff's office knew about it. That is the second piece of this, because the FBI warning does not exist in isolation. It exists in the context of a sheriff's office with its own history, a history that sources familiar with the investigation have described as relevant to understanding how a case of this nature, with this level of planning and this level of documented prior risk, arrived at the outcome it arrived at without any institutional intervention. The question this video is going to answer is not just what the FBI warning said. It is who received it, what they did with it, and why a man who should have been on someone's radar was instead walking freely through a community where Nancy Guthrie volunteered twice a week, walked to Forsyth Park every morning, and had no reason in the world to be afraid of him. This is the full story of what was known, when it was known, and what was done, and not done, with that knowledge. Stay with me. You're before the institutions, before the warnings, before the history that investigators have spent months piecing together. There was Nancy Guthrie. And the only way to understand the weight of what the institutional failures in this case represent is to understand, first, who they failed. Nancy was 63 years old. She had lived on Habersham Street in Savannah's Victorian district for 22 years. The house had been hers and Robert's, her husband, who had died 11 years before her disappearance, quietly and without warning, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Nancy had stayed after he died because the house was hers in a way that went beyond ownership. The garden she had built over 2 decades was hers. The neighbors who knew her name and her routine and her dog's name, she had not had a dog in years, but they still asked about the last one, were hers. The wide front porch with the 2 green chairs, painted a shade she had spent 3 weekends choosing, was hers. She had been a licensed practical nurse for 31 years, cardiac unit at Memorial Health University Medical Center. Her former colleagues described her the same way, independently, when reporters sought them out after she disappeared. Patient, steady, present in the way that matters most in a medical setting, genuinely, completely there with the person in front of her, regardless of what else was happening around her. One of her supervisors told a Savannah television station that Nancy had a quality she had rarely seen in 30 years of hospital administration. She made every patient feel like the most important person in the building, because when she was with them, they were. She had retired 18 months before she disappeared. The retirement had widened her life rather than narrowing it. She volunteered at a food pantry in the East Side neighborhood on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had taken up watercolor painting, which she described to her daughter Carla as simultaneously humbling and deeply satisfying. She was enrolled in a beginner Spanish class at the community center. She had a handwritten list in a kitchen drawer of places she had never been and wanted to visit. Portugal at the top, then Oaxaca, then Japan. 2 adult children, Carla in Pooler, who called almost every evening, David in Atlanta, who drove down once a month, a relationship with both of them that was, by every account, warm and uncomplicated and real. Her routines were as steady and predictable as anything in her life. Morning walk to Forsyth Park at 6:45, coffee before and after. The food pantry on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Afternoons for errands and neighbors and phone calls. Evenings at home with dinner and the news and a book and chamomile tea and bed by 10 or 10:30. The last confirmed normal moment of her life was a 14-minute phone call with Carla at 9:12 p.m. that Tuesday evening. Nancy talked about her Spanish class, a mispronunciation that had made the whole room laugh. She mentioned a neighbor who had stopped by. She said she was tired. She said she loved Carla. She said goodnight. The next morning, the calls went unanswered. By 9:52 a.m., Carla was on the porch. The door was locked. The car was in the driveway. Inside, the purse, the phone, the reading glasses on the nightstand beside an open book left face down, The chamomile tea on the kitchen counter, half full. Nancy was gone. Savannah Chatham Metropolitan Police arrived at 10:14 a.m. Within the first hours of processing the scene, the picture that emerged was consistent with what investigators would later characterize as a prepared and practiced abduction. No forced entry at the front. The back door lock manipulated with precision. Not broken, not kicked. Opened cleanly by someone who had done something similar before. The house undisturbed to a degree that spoke to procedure rather than impulse. A neighbor's camera had captured the figure at 1:47 a.m. Dark clothing, dark cap, 11 seconds, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone finishing a task. Internet service records had shown the 27-minute outage beginning at 1:15 a.m., a targeted, reversible interruption of the home's connectivity that had blinded the cloud-connected cameras during the critical window. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation arrived on day 3. The FBI's Savannah field office assumed a leading role from day 5. Forensic teams processed the home. Trace evidence from the rear entry point was submitted to the GBI laboratory and then to the FBI's own facilities. The behavioral analysis component of the FBI's involvement began generating a profile of the likely perpetrator from the earliest days, and that profile pointed, consistently and specifically, towards someone with prior knowledge of the victim, prior knowledge of the property, and prior knowledge of the security infrastructure. Someone who had been there before. Someone who had planned this over an extended period. Someone who, in the assessment of behavioral analysts, had not arrived at this moment without a history. That assessment, the conclusion that the behavioral signature of this crime pointed to someone with a relevant prior history, was the foundation of what investigators began looking for in the weeks that followed. Not just who had done this, but what was known about them, what was in the record, what had been seen before and documented before, and, the question that would eventually land with considerable weight, what had been warned about before. The FBI warning has not been fully disclosed in official public statements. What has emerged through sources familiar with the investigation, and through reporting by credible news organizations covering the case, is a picture that, while incomplete in its specifics, is clear enough in its broad outline to be addressed directly. Prior to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, information had been generated through federal investigative activity that was relevant to the individual now in custody. The nature of that information, whether it arose from a specific investigation, from intelligence gathering, from a tip, or from some other federal process, has not been publicly confirmed. What sources have described is the following: that information existed at the federal level that characterized this individual as someone whose behavioral profile and history warranted attention. That this characterization was communicated through channels consistent with interagency notification, the kind of communication that flows between federal and local law enforcement when the FBI believes that a local agency's awareness of a specific individual is relevant to public safety in their jurisdiction. That communication reached the Chatham County Sheriff's Office. The response to that communication, what the Sheriff's Office did with the information, how it was logged, whether it generated any active monitoring or follow-up, and whether it was connected in any way to the community where Nancy Guthrie was known to interact with the individual now in custody, is the part of this story that investigators and journalists have been pressing on since the early weeks of the case, and the answers that have come back have not been satisfying. Sources familiar with the investigation have described the handling of the FBI's communication as inadequate, not in the sense that a law was broken or that a specific procedural rule was violated, but inadequate in the sense that the information, once received, does not appear to have generated the kind of active response that its content arguably warranted. The individual was not placed under any form of monitoring. No outreach was made to community organizations where he was known to be active. No warning, however informal, reached the volunteer network where he and Nancy Guthrie had a shared history. The information existed, it was communicated, and then, somewhere in the institutional process, it stopped moving. With the sheriff's secret history, the phrase that has circulated in investigative reporting on this case, refers not only to the handling of the FBI warning, but to a broader pattern within the Chatham County Sheriff's Office that sources have identified as contextually relevant to understanding how that warning was processed and why it did not generate more or urgent action. The specifics of that history involve a series of decisions and incidents within the Sheriff's Office over a period of years preceding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The full details of those incidents have not been publicly disclosed. What sources have described, in general terms, is a pattern of decisions related to the handling of risk assessments and threat information that reflected institutional priorities that were not fully aligned with proactive public safety intervention. In practical terms, a culture within that office of treating incoming risk information as something to be logged and filed rather than acted upon. A culture of handling warnings from federal partners as notifications to be acknowledged rather than triggers for active local response. A culture that, when the FBI communicated that a specific individual warranted attention, produced an acknowledgement and a file entry rather than a response. That culture did not create the man who took Nancy Guthrie. He made the decisions he made, over 8 months of planning, entirely on his own. The institutional history of the sheriff's office did not cause what happened on Habersham Street, but it may have allowed it to happen without the intervention that a different institutional culture might have produced. That is the distinction that matters here, not causation, opportunity. The opportunity that exists when a warning is received and filed rather than acted upon. The opportunity that a person with a plan depends on. The gap between what is known and what is done with what is known. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that gap was 27 minutes wide on a Tuesday morning, but it had been open for much longer than that. What reunited the FBI's assessment that the suspect could strike again was not, investigators have emphasized, a speculative or precautionary statement. It was grounded in the behavioral analysis of the case, specifically in the profile of an individual who had demonstrated a capacity for extended, patient, methodical planning, who had researched his methods over 8 months, who had conducted in-person surveillance of his target on at least 3 confirmed occasions in the 6 days before the abduction, who had identified, neutralized, and then restored the security infrastructure at a specific address in a 27-minute window that left almost no visible trace. That profile does not describe someone who acted impulsively and is unlikely to repeat. It describes someone who invested significant time and effort in developing a methodology, someone for whom the execution of that methodology was the product of sustained commitment, someone who, if the target of that methodology were removed or unavailable, would likely, as in the assessment of behavioral analysts, identify a new target and apply the same methodology again. The FBI's communication to the sheriff's office had included this assessment. The characterization of the suspect as someone whose behavioral profile suggested ongoing risk to the community, not just risk to a specific identified individual, but risk to the broader population of people who fit the profile of potential targets, had been part of the warning. That characterization had been received. It had been filed. And then Nancy Guthrie had disappeared, and the FBI had come to Savannah, and the warning was still in a file somewhere in the sheriff's building, and the man it had warned about was in the federal system, and Nancy Guthrie was still missing. The press conference on day 41, the conference at which the U.S. Attorney announced the DNA match and described the scope of the premeditation evidence, included a moment that reporters in the room later described as one of the most tension-filled of the entire conference. A reporter asked directly about the prior communication from the FBI to the sheriff's office, about what had been known before Nancy disappeared, about what had been done with what was known. The U.S. Attorney paused. She looked at the reporter. She said that the question of what information existed prior to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance and how that information was handled by relevant agencies was a matter that the Department of Justice was examining as part of a broader review of the case. She said she was not in a position to provide details of that review at this time. She said she understood why the question was being asked. She did not say the review had found no failures. She did not say the warning had been adequately handled. She said she understood why the question was being asked. The sheriff's office, when contacted by journalists following the press conference, declined to comment on the specific question of the prior FBI communication. A spokesperson said the office was cooperating fully with the federal investigation and would not be making additional statements at this time. The review continues. The individual in custody is a 61-year-old man who had known Nancy Guthrie for approximately 9 years through community volunteering at the food pantry in the East Side neighborhood. He had no criminal record, no prior convictions, nothing in any public database that would have appeared as a warning in a standard background check. The evidence assembled against him is, by all accounts, substantial. The DNA match from the rear entry point of Nancy's home, the 8 months of search history traced to his IP address, the The cell tower data placing his phone in the vicinity of Habersham Street on multiple surveillance dates and on the night of the abduction. The vehicle identified through multiple independent camera sources. The device contents, organized notes, photographs of Nancy's property taken across multiple seasons, communications that forensic analysts have characterized as documenting the progression of a plan. He is being held without bail. Federal charges have been filed. His attorney has entered a not guilty plea. No trial date has been set. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. Searches of tidal and marsh areas south and southeast of Savannah, identified through geographic data on his seized device, are ongoing. No results have been publicly disclosed. The community that Nancy was part of, the neighbors on Habersham Street, the volunteers at the food pantry, the members of her Spanish class and her watercolor group, has had to absorb not only her disappearance and the arrest of someone many of them knew, but the emerging understanding that someone in a position to act on a warning may not have acted, that the information existed, that it moved through institutional channels, that somewhere in those channels it stopped. Carla Guthrie, Nancy's daughter, has spoken publicly throughout the investigation. She has been measured and clear in every statement. She has said she wants Nancy home. She has said she wants the full truth, all of it, including the institutional truth, to come out. She has said that her mother spent 31 years making sure people felt safe, and that the question of whether someone in a position to protect her community had the information to do so, and did not, is a question that deserves a real answer. She is right. It does. Before we close, there are 3 specific lessons from this case, and specifically from the institutional dimension of it, that demand to be addressed directly. The first lesson is about the gap between information and action at the institutional level, and what it means for ordinary people who exist within the systems those institutions are supposed to protect. The FBI warning in this case was real. The communication was made through appropriate channels. The information reached the relevant local agency. And then, somewhere between receipt and response, something failed. The lesson for individuals is uncomfortable but necessary. You cannot assume that because a warning exists within an institution, it will be acted upon in a way that protects you. Institutional knowledge and institutional action are not the same thing. If you have reason to believe that someone in your community represents a risk, if you have information that you have shared with law enforcement and are uncertain whether it has been acted upon, you have the right to follow up. You have the right to ask what has been done with your information. You have the right to escalate, to contact a different agency, to advocate for action. Institutions are made of people and processes, and both are fallible. Your safety cannot be fully outsourced to any of them. The second lesson concerns the specific behavioral profile that the FBI identified as indicating ongoing risk. The assessment that this suspect could strike again was not based on speculation. It was based on the specific nature of the planning documented in the evidence, the methodical research, the long preparation window, the systematic identification and neutralization of obstacles. The behavioral profile of someone who invests that level of effort in planning a crime is not the profile of someone who acts once out of circumstance and then stops. It is the profile of someone who has developed a methodology, who has tested that methodology, who, absent intervention, will apply it again. The lesson is that the most dangerous people in any community are often not the ones who have been arrested and convicted. They are already in the system. The most dangerous people are often the ones who have avoided the system entirely, whose capacity for planning means they have never been caught, and whose clean record is not evidence of safety, but evidence of competence. A clean record is not the same as an absence of danger. It is sometimes evidence of the opposite. The third lesson is about community awareness as a layer of protection that exists independent of institutional systems. The volunteer network where this suspect and Nancy Guthrie were both known to be active was a community. Communities have eyes. Communities have instincts. Communities notice things that databases do not contain. One of the most consistent findings in the research on community-based crime prevention is that informal social networks, the neighbors who talk to each other, the volunteers who pay attention to who is present and who is not, the community members who notice when something feels wrong, provide a layer of awareness that formal institutional systems cannot replicate. That layer does not prevent everything. It did not prevent what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but it is a layer worth investing in. Know your neighbors. Pay attention to the people in your shared community spaces. Trust the instinct that says something feels wrong, even when you cannot explain it. And when that instinct speaks, act on it, not with alarm or accusation, but with attention and communication. The community is a system too, and it can catch what the institutions miss. Nancy Guthrie was 63 years old. She had a list of places she wanted to go, with Portugal at the top. She had chamomile tea in the evenings and a book face down on her nightstand. She had a garden she had built over 20 years, and porch chairs painted the color of the evening light on Habersham Street. She spent her career making sure frightened people felt safe. The warning existed. It was communicated. Somewhere, it stopped. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. And the institutions that received that warning deserve to answer for what they did with it. If you have any information related to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance or the ongoing search efforts in Chatham County and surrounding coastal Georgia, please contact the FBI's Savannah Field Office or the Chatham County Sheriff's tip line directly. Both remain active. Now I want to hear from you. The FBI warning, the communication that existed before Nancy disappeared, that reached the sheriff's office and did not produce adequate action. Does that change how you think about the institutional systems that are supposed to protect communities? And do you believe that the review the Department of Justice has described will produce real accountability? Or do you think it will be another document that gets filed and forgotten? Tell me in the comments. This community takes institutional accountability seriously, and your perspective is part of this conversation. If you believe that understanding the full picture, not just the crime, not just the evidence, but the institutional failures that allowed it to happen, is worth your time, then subscribe. Every week we go deep on the cases that demand real answers. The evidence, the systems, the failures, and the human cost of all of it. Hit the like button if this video gave you something to think about. It helps more people find Nancy's story, and Nancy Guthrie's name deserves to be known. We'll see you in the next one.